In 1778, on the wild lands of Louisiana, a Catholic priest called an enslaved woman a public prostitute. He ordered her to be whipped. Her crime was not stealing. It was not hurting anyone. Her crime was living with a French merchant who had chosen to be with her and having his children. Her name was Marie Therese Metoyer. She was 36 years old. She had given birth 15 times, and she had never been free, not even for a single day. But then something happened that nobody in that area expected. When the priest's accusations put CoinCoin at risk of being sold to the slave markets of New Orleans, the French merchant Claude Thomas Pierre Metoyer did not walk away. He bought her, and then he set her free. What he gave her was not much by any measure, just 67 acres of low, wet land along the Cane River, a small piece of Louisiana wilderness, thick with cypress trees and tall cane grass, with water on one side and wild, open land on the other. There was no big house. There was no fortune waiting for her. There was only dirt, and the knowledge that, for the first time in 36 years, whatever she grew belonged to her. But what CoinCoin did with that land was anything but small. She planted tobacco, even though she had never farmed before. She trapped bears for their fur and their fat. She made medicines using knowledge her African-born parents had taught her as a child. These were healing remedies rooted in real science, knowledge that had crossed the ocean inside the minds of people who were not allowed to bring anything else with them. By 1792, she was sending 300 bearskins, 2 barrels of bear fat, and nearly 10,000 rolls of tobacco to markets in New Orleans. And every dollar she earned beyond what she needed to survive went toward one single goal: buying her children out of slavery, one by one. By the end of her life, CoinCoin owned more than 1,000 acres of land and had freed 6 members of her family from bondage. Her sons built on what she had started. They became the wealthiest free family of color in the entire United States. They built plantations. They founded St. Augustine Church on Isle Breville, believed to be the first Catholic church in America built by and for free people of color. They created a community along the Cane River that stretched across 18,000 acres of land. I want to stop and sit with that for just a moment. A woman born into slavery, whipped for the crime of being loved, built a dynasty that has lasted for centuries. Her descendants still live on that same land today. They still own roughly 16,000 of those original 18,000 acres. The land itself is the proof. Not a statue someone built later. Not a plaque on a wall. The actual ground, still in the hands of the family that first worked it as free people. That is not just a story about race. That is a story about what a human being can build when even the smallest opening appears in the wall around them. But the opening that CoinCoin walked through was not an accident. It existed because Louisiana was not like the rest of America. To understand the Creoles, you have to understand a system that most Americans were never taught about, because it was wiped out on purpose. And what DNA testing has done, more than anything else, is prove that it was real. In the Anglo-American South, the world had 2 boxes, white and black. You were one or the other. Your children were one or the other. The line between them was absolute, even when it made no sense. Even when someone had to be told which box another person belonged in, because simply looking at them would never tell you. Louisiana was different. For more than a century under French and Spanish rule, Louisiana operated with 3 levels: white at the top, enslaved at the bottom, and in between, a third category that had no equal anywhere else in the American experience: the gens de couleur libre, the free people of color. The French Code Noir, or Black Code, was cruel in many ways, but it included rules that the Anglo-American system never offered. It recognized marriages between enslaved people. It allowed enslaved individuals to buy their own freedom under certain conditions. And when Spain took control of Louisiana in 1763, the Spanish legal system went even further, making it easier to grant freedom, giving land to free people of color, and creating pathways that simply did not exist under English law. Freedom was not common, but it was possible. And possibility changes everything. These were not people waiting to be told who they were. They were not confused about their identity. They were a social class. They owned property. They ran businesses. They educated their children, often sending them to school in France. They spoke French. They practiced Catholicism. They had their own neighborhoods, their own social circles, their own economy. In 1791, free people of color made up more than a quarter of the free population of New Orleans. 1 in 4 free people walking the streets of that city was neither white nor enslaved, but something the rest of America refused to even imagine. They were iron workers and cigar makers, musicians and midwives. They built the famous wrought iron balconies that still line the French Quarter today. They developed a style of cooking that blended African techniques with French elegance, built on a base of onion, celery, and bell pepper that Creole cooks call the Holy Trinity. They created a musical tradition that would eventually give the world jazz and zydeco. All of this came from the middle space, from the category that was not supposed to exist. Some of them were extremely wealthy. Some of them, in the painful irony of that era, even owned enslaved people themselves. They were not saints. They were not symbols. They were people trying to survive a world full of impossible contradictions, using whatever tools that world gave them. And they built a culture so rich that it still defines one of America's most beloved cities. In 1845, 17 Creole poets published Les Senelles, a collection of 84 poems written entirely in French. It was the first poetry anthology by people of color in the United States. Let that sink in. The first time Americans of African descent gathered their literary voices into a single book, those voices spoke French. They wrote about love, disappointment, and the ache of ambition with nowhere to go. They modeled their work on the French Romantic poets as a deliberate statement. We are this cultured. We are this educated. We belong. The editor, Armand Lanous, was light-skinned enough to be mistaken for white. He never tried to pass. He founded schools for children of color. In his introduction, he wrote that the book was meant to defend his community and his people, to preserve their achievements for future generations. Culture as a shield, literature as proof of humanity. But the poets could not protest directly. Louisiana law threatened life in prison or even death for publishing anything that might encourage discontent among the enslaved. So the poets chose a title that said everything without saying it outright. Les Senelles, the hawthorn berries. Small, rare wild fruits that grow in harsh ground and are worth the danger of picking. Only 5 original copies of that book survive today. That is what the Creole community was. A fruit that grew where it was never supposed to survive. And the people who gathered it knew exactly what it cost. Here is what pulled me into this story, and has not let me go. It was not the poetry. It was not the plantations. It was not even the DNA. It was a street. Canal Street in New Orleans. If you have ever walked it, you know it is wide. Almost comically wide for a city built on a swamp. There is a reason for that. Canal Street was the border. On one side lived the Creoles, in what we now call the French Quarter, the Vieux Carré. On the other side lived the Americans, the English-speaking Protestant newcomers who flooded into Louisiana after the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. The grassy middle of Canal Street became known as the neutral ground, a phrase still used in New Orleans today for any median strip. Two civilizations, two languages, two religions, two completely different ideas about what a human being is, separated by a patch of grass and a streetcar line. When the Americans arrived, the Creoles did not welcome them as liberators. They saw them as invaders. The Americans brought English instead of French, Protestantism instead of Catholicism, common law instead of the Napoleonic Code. And above all, they brought a racial framework with only two categories. You were white or you were black. There was nothing in between. The three-tiered system that had governed Louisiana for a century could not survive this clash. What happened next took decades, but the direction was clear from the very beginning. The middle was squeezed out. Free people of color were stripped of their rights. French was pushed out of schools. Creole children were punished for speaking their mother tongue. And slowly, then faster, the three-tiered world collapsed into two. By 1890, Louisiana had its Separate Car Act, requiring different railroad cars for white and colored passengers. And here, the story bends towards something that still makes my chest tighten. Because the man who sat in the wrong railroad car was a Creole, and his very body was the argument. Homer Plessy was 7/8 European. By every visible measure, he appeared white. The East Louisiana Railroad had to be told in advance that he was legally classified as colored, because otherwise, not a single person on that train would have known. That was exactly the point. The Comité des Citoyens, a group of Creole and black activists in New Orleans, chose Plessy precisely because his body exposed the total absurdity of the law. If you had to be told that someone was black in order to segregate them, then what exactly were you segregating? The Supreme Court ruled against him 7-1. Plessy v. Ferguson, separate but equal. The decision that would define American race relations for 58 years was born from a Creole man the law could not see, and a Creole community the law refused to acknowledge. Think about what was lost in that ruling. Not just Plessy's case, the entire middle space. The court was not just saying that segregation was legal. It was saying there were only two races, that the line between them was clear, and that the government had the right to enforce that line. For the Creoles, that ruling did not just segregate them. It defined them out of existence. The in-between space where they had lived for 150 years was sealed shut. Not gradually, but by law. And then came the quiet erasure. Between 1949 and 1965, a woman named Naomi Drake served as registrar of the Bureau of Vital Statistics in New Orleans. She was given authority over birth and death certificates, and she used that power to hunt. Drake kept a list of approximately 250 French surnames that she considered suspicious, old Creole family names. If your name appeared on that list, she would pull your file. She would trace your family history back 4, sometimes 5 generations, And if she found any record previously marked colored, mulatto, or Negro, she would change your racial classification on your birth certificate, from white to Negro. She did not notify you. She did not ask your permission. She simply altered the document that defined who you were in the eyes of the government. When families came to request their own birth certificates, they found them withheld, held hostage until they accepted the new classification. Parents could not enroll their children in school. People could not complete wills or finalize adoptions. A boxer named Ralph Dupas spent 3 years in court because Drake had changed his deceased mother's race on her death certificate. By the time Drake was fired in 1965, she had withheld nearly 5,000 birth certificates and more than 1,000 death certificates. Thousands of lives, reclassified by one woman with a pen and a list of French surnames. I keep coming back to what that must have felt like. Not just the legal damage, which was devastating enough, but the personal wound. To live your entire life as one thing. To build a family and a community around an identity your grandparents gave you. And to be told by a stranger in a government office that you were wrong. That the paperwork says otherwise. That the paperwork wins. If you care about identity and what survives the systems built to erase it, staying with these stories matters. Because these stories need to be told more often and more carefully than they usually are. Now imagine what happened when DNA arrived. When Creole families began opening their ancestry results in the 2000s, many found exactly what they had always known, and nothing like what America had told them. The genetic signature was distinct. Studies of people who identified as Louisiana Creoles showed an average ancestry that was roughly 3/4 sub-Saharan African and about 1/5 European. But the European part told a story that no other group in the American South shared. It was French, not British, not the Anglo-Saxon trace found in African American populations from Virginia, the Carolinas, or Georgia. The Creole genome carried France itself, specifically woven into its very structure. That stopped me cold when I first read it. Because think about what that means for someone opening an envelope from a DNA testing company. You expected to see European ancestry. You got France. Not a vague stamp of European. The specific country that colonized the specific swamp where your grandmother's grandmother spoke a specific language that was not quite French and not quite anything else. The blood remembered the address. In plain terms, the DNA confirmed the history. The mixing that produced the Creole people happened under French colonial rules, between French settlers and enslaved Africans brought from specific parts of West Africa. Not the same enslaved populations as the rest of the South, not the same colonial frameworks, not the same cultural pathways. The African origins were just as specific. Historian Gwendolyn Midlow Hall spent decades tracing the roots of enslaved people in Louisiana. What she documented was remarkable. During the French colonial period, between 1719 and 1731, more than 6,000 enslaved Africans were brought to Louisiana, mostly from Senegambia, from peoples like the Bambara, the Mandinka, and the Wolof. These were the founding African population of what would become Creole Louisiana. Then came a second wave. During the Spanish colonial period, roughly 10,000 people were brought to Louisiana from the Congo region. Scholars use the term Congolization to describe it. It was a complete reshaping of the colony's African cultural identity. 2 layers, 2 distinct African heritages, folded one on top of the other in a single colony, mixing with French, Spanish, and Native American bloodlines across generations. The first wave brought Bambara rice-growing techniques that turned Louisiana's swamps into productive farmland. It brought musical traditions that would shape the rhythms of an entire continent. The second wave brought Congolese spiritual practices, artistic traditions, and funeral customs that still echo in New Orleans jazz funerals today. These were not nameless, faceless masses. They were specific peoples from specific places carrying specific knowledge. And that specificity, invisible for centuries, was suddenly showing up in the genetic data. None of this was generic. None of this was African American in the way that term is usually understood. Louisiana's enslaved population had its own layered complexity, its own internal diversity. And that diversity, buried for centuries under the heavy weight of the one-drop rule and Jim Crow, was suddenly visible in the data. 23andMe eventually recognized Louisiana Creoles as their own distinct genetic communities. The Florida Parishes Creoles, the River Parishes Creoles, and the Greater New Orleans Creoles. Not subcategories, distinct populations with their own genetic patterns and their own deep roots in specific landscapes. A genetic identity just as particular as the cultural one that had been growing on that same ground for 300 years. I want to be careful here. DNA does not tell you who you are. It tells you where your ancestors came from and who they were with. Identity is culture. It is language. It is gumbo and zydeco, and the way your grandmother said her rosary in Curi Vini. But what DNA did for the Creoles was something very specific and very powerful. It confirmed a complexity that America had spent 2 centuries trying to flatten. The 3-tiered world that the Americans dismantled after 1803, the middle category they erased, was real. It was not a made-up story or a romantic fantasy. It was an actual population with a distinct genetic profile that had been forming for more than 100 years before the first English-speaking Americans ever set foot in New Orleans. The blood knew what the government officials denied. And yet, the story is not finished. What we still do not fully know is how deep the Native American thread runs in Creole ancestry. Genetic studies consistently show a small percentage, usually around 1 or 2%. But the tools may be undercounting it. The indigenous peoples of Louisiana, the Choctaw, the Natchez, the Homa, were part of the colonial world from the very beginning, and Creole families carry those stories in their oral traditions. The DNA has not fully caught up to the memory. There is another kind of unfinished business, one that no genetic test can resolve. Curi Vini, the Creole language, is critically endangered. Fewer than 10,000 speakers remain, and many of them are elderly. The language was born on the same plantations where CoinCoin once worked, formed from West African grammar wrapped around French vocabulary. For generations, it was the common language of southern Louisiana, spoken across racial lines by anyone who had lived there long enough to belong. Its name means to run, to come. And for a long time, the language was running away faster than anyone could bring it back. Parents stopped teaching it. Schools punished children for speaking it. The broader culture dismissed it as broken French, which it was not. It was its own language, with its own rules, its own beauty, and its own way of carrying a history that English was never built to hold. But something is shifting. New speakers are learning Curi Vini. Language classes are growing. Musicians are writing songs in it. In 2023, the first film spoken entirely in Curi Vini was produced. The revival is small, but it is real. and it carries a weight that goes beyond words. Because what these speakers are choosing is not just a language. They are choosing the in-between space. They are saying that the middle was never a compromise. It was a homeland. And they are choosing it in the same century that their DNA confirmed it was always real. That is what moves me most about this story. Not the science, not the history, the timing. For 200 years, an entire culture was told that the space it occupied was not legitimate, that it had to pick a side, that the in-between was either confusion, cowardice, or fraud. And then, in the same generation that is reviving the language, reclaiming the food, and rebuilding the music, the double helix itself speaks up and says, "No, this was real. This was always real. You were never confused. You were a people." Consider where we started. CoinCoin, an enslaved woman on the frontier, building a 1,000-acre empire out of bearskins and tobacco and sheer, unbreakable refusal. Her descendants writing poetry in French under penalty of death. A man who looked white sitting in the wrong railroad car because the law needed to be shown its own face. A registrar with a list of surnames erasing identities one certificate at a time. And now, centuries later, a tube of saliva confirming what no one had the power to destroy. The Louisiana Creoles were never what America thought they were. They were not confused. They were not passing. They were not caught between two worlds. They were a world, a complete one, with their own language, their own food, their own music, their own law, their own literature, their own church, and their own genetic signature written into the double helix the whole time, waiting for someone to finally read it. On the Cane River, somewhere near Natchitoches, there is a cemetery where CoinCoin was buried more than 200 years ago. Her grave has no marker, but the land around it, 16,000 acres of it, still belongs to her family. And the church her son built still holds services every Sunday. The boxes could not hold her. They never could.